Kang Min-jae slept beneath a Seoul bridge with the waitress's name still clenched inside his fist. 6 months earlier, men twice his size had lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Now the concrete beneath his back was cold enough to seep through his thin jacket, and the smell of damp cardboard mixed with exhaust from the traffic overhead. He had no driver waiting nearby, no black sedan idling at the curb, no bodyguards scanning the street. His expensive watch was gone. His tailored suit was gone. Even the phone that could summon an entire organization with one call was gone. Min-jae had removed every trace of the man Seoul knew as the head of one of Korea's most feared criminal empires. He wanted to become invisible. He wanted to become ordinary. Most of all, he wanted to find Han Soo-jin, the waitress who had saved his life. He remembered her hands first. Small hands, trembling beneath the warm yellow light of a nearly empty restaurant, sliding a bowl of steaming broth across the counter while rainwater dripped from his coat onto the wooden floor. She had not known who he was that night. She had only seen a wounded stranger standing in her doorway, pale and barely able to remain upright. "Sit down," she had whispered. "You look like you're going to fall." Min-jae had obeyed. Nobody gave him orders. Nobody dared. But Soo-jin had spoken without fear because she had never known what his name meant. That memory had followed him through every marble hallway and every silent meeting room since. Now, beneath the bridge, he opened his empty hand and stared at the faint ink mark on his palm. Han Soo-jin. He had written it there because he had nothing else left. 3 months of searching had produced nothing. Her apartment had been empty. Her old workplace had no forwarding address. The restaurant where she had served him had closed without explanation. Every database his people could access had failed to locate her. Money had bought Min-jae buildings, loyalty, silence, and fear. It had not bought him the one answer he needed. So he had abandoned everything. At dawn, he walked through the narrow streets with $20 in his pocket and a worn backpack over one shoulder. The pavement was slick beneath his shoes. Neon signs reflected in shallow puddles, and the sharp smell of roasted coffee drifted from a convenience store as workers unlocked the doors. He stopped outside the window. A waitress inside placed cups on a counter. For half a second, Min-jae froze. The woman turned. Wrong face. He lowered his eyes and kept walking. By noon, his stomach was empty. By evening, his jacket was soaked with sweat and city dust. Yet he did not return to the luxury apartment waiting for him across Seoul. There was no apartment anymore. He had given the keys away. Tonight, he would sleep wherever he could. Because if Han Soo-jin had once saved Kang Min-jae when he had nothing left to give, then he would find her now by becoming the one thing she might recognize without knowing his name, a man with nothing. And somewhere in Seoul, the waitress who had saved a stranger was still waiting to discover what that stranger had become. 6 months earlier, Kang Min-jae had been the most untouchable man in Seoul, but on the night Han Soo-jin saved him, none of that power could keep him standing. His black sedan had stopped 2 blocks from the little restaurant after midnight, its engine ticking softly in the cold, empty street. Min-jae had stumbled through the back entrance with one hand pressed against his side, his expensive coat soaked through, the sharp smell of rain and gasoline clinging to the fabric. Soo-jin was wiping the last table when she heard the metal door scrape against the floor. She turned with a dish towel in her hand. The restaurant was almost empty, warm amber bulbs glowing above scratched wooden tables, steam rising from a pot of broth behind the counter. Then she saw him, a stranger in a black suit, breathing hard, one hand gripping the doorframe. "Sir," she called. Min-jae tried to answer, but his knees gave way. He caught the edge of a chair before hitting the floor. Soo-jin dropped the towel and ran toward him. She did not scream. She did not run for the phone. She simply knelt beside him and looked at his face. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly. Even then, there was something commanding in them, something that made people instinctively step back. Soo-jin only frowned. "You need help." "No hospital," he managed. "Why?" she asked. He said nothing. His breathing grew heavier. Soo-jin looked toward the front windows, then back at the man on the floor. Whatever had happened before he entered that restaurant was none of her business. She had one rule for herself: help the person in front of her first. She locked the front door, turned off the sign, and pulled the curtains closed. The metal latch clicked into place. Then she dragged a chair beside him and helped him sit. "Stay here." She hurried behind the counter, returned with a clean towel, and placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of him. The scent of beef broth, garlic, and green onions filled the small room. Min-jae stared at it. "I can't pay you." Soo-jin pushed the spoon closer. "Then don't." He looked at her as if she had spoken another language. Nobody had ever said those words to him. She noticed his expensive watch, his polished shoes, the dark vehicle visible through the gap in the curtain. But she asked no questions. Instead, she poured him a glass of water. "Eat slowly." Min-jae obeyed. Each spoonful warmed his throat, and the trembling in his hands gradually eased. When he finally looked up, Soo-jin was standing several feet away, folding the same dish towel she had dropped. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered. "Han Soo-jin." He repeated it quietly. "Soo-jin." She nodded. "And yours?" For the first time in years, Kang Min-jae lied about his name. "Min," she smiled faintly. "Then Min, finish your soup." Before sunrise, she opened the back door and helped him leave through the alley. She gave him an old gray scarf from the lost and found box and refused the cash he tried to place on the counter. "You saved me," he said. Soo-jin shook her head. "I just gave you dinner." Then she returned inside and locked the door. Min-jae stood beneath the pale streetlight, the scarf rough against his neck, watching her silhouette disappear behind the frosted glass. He did not know then that 6 months later, he would give up his entire life just to find her. 6 months after that night, Kang Min-jae stood outside the restaurant where Han Soo-jin had once pushed a bowl of steaming soup toward him, but the windows were dark and the familiar wooden door was chained shut. Dust coated the glass. A faded, closed sign hung crookedly beneath the yellow awning, tapping softly against the window whenever the evening wind passed. Min-jae reached through the bars and touched the old brass handle. Cold metal pressed against his fingertips. Behind him, Seoul moved as it always did. Buses hissed at the curb, tires whispered over wet pavement, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifted from a nearby street cart. But the small restaurant was silent. 6 months earlier, he had left that doorway wearing Soo-jin's gray scarf. He had returned the next morning with an envelope of cash, only to find the restaurant already locked. He had sent people to ask questions, but every answer led nowhere. Tonight, he had come himself. He stepped back and studied the dark interior through the dusty glass. The counter was still there. The faded menu board still hung above it. Even the small ceramic bowl she had used that night sat upside down beside the sink. Min-jae removed his gloves. He pressed his palm against the window, as if the warmth from his hand could somehow reach the empty room. Then he turned away. "Find the owner," he told the driver waiting across the street. His voice was quiet. "And don't scare him." The driver nodded and disappeared into the traffic. Min-jae walked 2 blocks alone. He had always believed that every disappearance had an explanation, every absence a price, every unanswered question a person powerful enough could force open. But Soo-jin had left no trail that money could simply purchase. Her old apartment building stood above a narrow convenience store, its concrete stairwell smelling of detergent and instant noodles. Min-jae climbed 3 flights and stopped before the apartment number he had been given. The door was painted blue. He knocked once. Nothing. Twice. Still nothing. He tried the neighboring door instead. An elderly tenant opened it only a few inches, chains still fastened. Min-jae showed no badge, no expensive watch, no sign of authority.
"I'm looking for Han Soo-jin."
The woman studied his worn coat. She moved. When? A few months ago. The door began to close. Min-jae placed his hand against the frame, then immediately withdrew it. Did she leave anything? The woman shook her head. No. The door clicked shut. Min-jae stood alone beneath the buzzing fluorescent light. Then he looked down at himself. His polished shoes. His black coat. The expensive car waiting below. None of it had brought Soo-jin back. He walked downstairs, crossed the street, and opened the rear door of his sedan. His driver turned. Where to? Min-jae stared at the leather seat for several seconds. Then he shut the door. Nowhere. The driver blinked. Sir? Min-jae removed his watch and placed it on the roof of the car.
Take this.
Sell it. He pulled the cash from his wallet and handed it over as well. Then he removed his tailored coat. This too. The driver stared at him. What are you doing? Min-jae looked toward the dark restaurant at the end of the street. If I can't find her as Kang Min-jae, he said, I'll find her as someone she would stop to help. Then he walked away from the car, carrying nothing but a worn backpack and the gray scarf Soo-jin had given him 6 months earlier. Behind him, the sedan remained motionless. For the first time, the most powerful man in his world had made a decision that money could not reverse. He would disappear until the waitress who once saved him could find him again. For the next 3 weeks, Kang Min-jae disappeared into Seoul without a single trace of the man he had once been. His black sedan was gone, his suits were gone, and the apartment overlooking the Han River stood empty behind locked doors. He slept beneath the bridge, on a thin piece of cardboard that softened only after several nights of use. The concrete stayed hard against his shoulder, the air carried the sour smell of exhaust and damp paper, and every morning began with the metallic rumble of buses passing overhead. He kept the gray scarf around his neck. It was the only thing he had refused to sell. During the day, he walked. He washed his face in public restrooms, bought the cheapest coffee he could find, and carried a battered backpack that grew heavier with every mile. People passed him without looking twice. That was exactly what he wanted. One afternoon, he sat outside a small bakery while warm air escaped through the open doorway, carrying the smell of butter and fresh bread onto the sidewalk. A woman stepped outside and handed him a paper bag. You haven't eaten today. Min-jae looked up. Why? She shrugged. Because you're sitting there. He accepted the bread. It was the first time since leaving his old life that someone had given him something without knowing his name. He tore the bag open, but before taking a bite, he remembered Soo-jin. Not her face. Her hands. The way she had pushed the bowl toward him and told him to eat slowly. So he kept walking. Every evening, he returned to the places where a waitress might work. Small diners, late-night cafes, family restaurants, food stalls beneath apartment buildings. He never asked for Soo-jin directly. He simply watched. He learned how long servers worked on their feet, how much they carried, how customers spoke when they believed nobody important was listening. At one diner, a manager pointed toward the door. We're full. Move along. Min-jae nodded and left. At another, a server quietly slipped him a cup of water before returning to work. He thanked her and moved on. Then one cold evening, his own body finally refused to cooperate. His legs weakened halfway down an alley, and he lowered himself against a brick wall. The bricks were rough beneath his coat, and the smell of fried oil drifted from a kitchen vent nearby. He closed his eyes. For the first time, the life he had chosen became physically difficult to continue. A passing delivery worker stopped.
Hey, you okay?
Min-jae opened his eyes.
Ivy fine.
The man pointed toward a community shelter 3 blocks away. They'll give you dinner. Min-jae almost refused. Then he remembered Soo-jin's voice. Eat slowly. He stood. At the shelter, fluorescent lights buzzed above rows of metal tables. Steam rose from trays of rice and soup. Min-jae accepted a bowl and sat alone. He took one spoonful, then another. It tasted nothing like Soo-jin's broth.
But
he finished every drop. The next morning, he made a decision. He would stop searching for her through places she might have worked. He would search where someone like her would go to help others. He folded the gray scarf carefully into his backpack and walked toward the city's largest community kitchen. He did not know it yet, but that decision would bring him closer to Han Soo-jin than all his money ever had. By 7 in the morning, the community kitchen was already alive with the scrape of metal trays and the steady hiss of boiling water. Kang Min-jae stood outside beneath a faded blue awning, his gray scarf tucked beneath his worn jacket, watching volunteers carry boxes of rice through the open doors. The smell of sesame oil and steamed rice drifted into the cold street. He had spent weeks searching Seoul for Han Soo-jin, but this was different. He was no longer looking for a restaurant. He was looking for the kind of place where someone like her might come when nobody was watching. Min-jae stepped inside. A volunteer handed him an apron. If you're here to eat, breakfast is at 8. If you're here to help, start with those. He pointed towards several heavy boxes stacked beside the kitchen wall. Min-jae nodded, tied the apron around his waist, and lifted the first box. The cardboard cut into his palms. He carried it across the room and set it beside the rice station. Then another. Then another. Nobody recognized him. Nobody lowered their voice when he walked past. For the first time, people simply expected him to work. Near noon, a woman placed a tray of soup in front of him. Take a break. Min-jae shook his head.
Hai fine.
She pointed toward his hands. You're bleeding. He looked down at the red marks across his palms and quietly sat. The soup smelled of garlic, green onions, and pepper. He lifted the spoon, but stopped halfway. The scent reminded him of another bowl, another room, another woman telling him to eat slowly. He lowered the spoon. You knew someone who cooked like this? The volunteer asked. Min-jae looked toward the kitchen. Someone saved me once. She smiled. Then maybe you're here to return the favor. He said nothing. The next afternoon, Min-jae arrived before the doors opened. He swept the floor, carried crates, washed steel pots, and stayed until the last table was wiped clean. On the fourth day, the kitchen became crowded. A line of people stretched onto the sidewalk, and the volunteers struggled to keep up. Min-jae stepped behind the serving counter without being asked. He filled bowls, passed rice, and moved with the same quiet efficiency he had once used to command entire rooms. Then a familiar voice came from behind him. You're giving too much rice to that man. Min-jae stopped. The sound was soft, practical, almost impatient. His fingers tightened around the metal serving spoon. He turned slowly. A woman stood beside the soup station wearing a plain navy apron, her dark hair tied loosely behind her neck. Her hands were warm from the steam rising around the pots. She was older than he remembered, or perhaps he had simply never looked closely enough that night. She lifted another bowl. If you keep filling them that high, we'll run out before everyone eats. Min-jae stared at her. Han Soo-jin did not recognize him. She stepped closer and took the spoon from his hand. You're new here, right? His throat tightened. Yes. She glanced at his worn jacket, then at the gray scarf around his neck. Her eyes paused for half a second. That scarf looks familiar. Min-jae lowered his gaze. She reached toward it, but stopped before touching him. Never mind. Then she turned back to the line. Come back tomorrow. We need extra hands. Min-jae watched her walk away through the steam. For 6 months, he had searched every corner of Seoul for the waitress who saved him. Now she was standing 3 feet away, speaking to him like a stranger. And for the first time, he had a chance to discover whether she would save the man beneath the disguise, too. The next morning, Kang Min-jae arrived before Han Soo-jin, carrying the same worn backpack and wearing the same gray scarf she had noticed the day before. The kitchen was still half dark, lit by a row of fluorescent tubes that hummed above the stainless steel counters. Steam curled from the stock pots, filling the room with the smell of beef broth and scallions. Soo-jin entered carrying 2 paper bags, stopped when she saw him, and raised an eyebrow. You're early. Min-jae took one of the bags from her. You said you needed extra hands. I did. She watched him carry the bags toward the counter. Most people disappear after one day. I'm not most people. The words came out before he could soften them. Soo-jin looked at him for a moment, then smiled. We'll see. For the next several days, Min-jae worked beside her without revealing who he was. She taught him how to portion rice, how to stack bowls without chipping their edges, how to stretch soup when more people arrived than expected. His hands, once accustomed to polished leather and expensive glass, became rough from hot water and industrial soap. The smell of detergent stayed beneath his fingernails. At lunch, Soo-jin placed a bowl in front of him.
Eat.
He looked at her. I'm working.
So am I.
I still eat. She pushed the spoon toward him. The small gesture struck him harder than it should have. 6 months ago, she had done the same thing. He lowered his eyes and began eating. Soo-jin watched him from across the counter. You really don't remember me, do you? Min-jae nearly dropped the spoon. He steadied it against the bowl. Should I? Oh. She shrugged.
No.
Forget it. She turned away. He wanted to tell her everything. His name, the restaurant, the night she had hidden him, the scarf. Instead, he said nothing. The next afternoon, Soo-jin asked him to deliver several meal boxes to an elderly couple 3 blocks away. Min-jae carried the boxes through narrow streets where the smell of laundry soap mixed with fried food from open storefronts. When he returned, Soo-jin was struggling with a heavy stockpot. He immediately stepped forward and lifted it from her hands. I've got it. She stared at him. You always do that. Do what? Act like carrying everything is your job. Min-jae set the pot down. The steel surface clanged against the counter. Maybe it is. She wiped her hands on her apron. You don't have to prove anything here. He looked at her. Nobody had ever said that to him either. That evening, after the last volunteer left, Soo-jin found him sitting outside the kitchen with a gray scarf folded across his knees. The streetlights cast pale reflections across the wet sidewalk, and the distant sound of traffic rolled between the buildings. She sat beside him. Where did you get that scarf? Min-jae's fingers tightened around the fabric. Someone gave it to me. A woman. He nodded. Soo-jin looked at the scarf again. Was she kind? Min-jae answered without hesitation. She saved my life. Soo-jin lowered her eyes. Then you should find her. He looked at her profile. I'm trying. She stood and picked up her bag. Then don't give up. She walked toward the street. Min-jae remained seated, the scarf warm from his hands. He could have called her name. He could have ended the disguise that night. Instead, he made a different choice. He would stay beside her until she chose to remember him, not because of his power, but because of the man he had become without it. 3 days later, the community kitchen closed early, and Han Soo-jin was carrying a stack of clean bowls toward the storage room when she noticed Kang Min-jae standing outside the back door with his backpack over one shoulder. The hallway smelled of dish soap and cooked rice, while cold air slipped through the half-open door and lifted the edge of his worn jacket. You're leaving? She asked. Min-jae looked at her. For a little while. Soo-jin set the bowls down. Where? I don't know yet. She studied him, then glanced at the gray scarf wrapped around his neck. You always answer like that. Like what? Like you're trying not to tell me something. Min-jae said nothing. Soo-jin stepped closer. You came here looking for someone. His eyes shifted toward the empty kitchen. Yes. Who? He rubbed his thumb along the rough edge of the backpack strap. Someone who once helped me when I had nothing. Soo-jin's expression changed. And you think she's here? I think she could be. What did she look like? Min-jae looked directly at her. She had tired hands. She worked late. She always gave away food she could have kept for herself. Soo-jin slowly lowered her eyes. That could describe half the people in the city. Not like her. The words settled between them. Then Soo-jin walked past him and opened the storage cabinet. Inside was a small cardboard box. She pulled it down, wiped dust from the lid, and placed it on the counter. I was going to throw this away. Min-jae did not move. She opened the box. Inside lay an old restaurant apron, a faded receipt, and a small envelope that had been folded twice. I used to work somewhere else, she said. A little restaurant that closed months ago. Min-jae's fingers tightened around the scarf. Why did you leave? Soo-jin looked at the envelope. Because someone told me I should. Who? She shook her head. It doesn't matter anymore. Min-jae stepped forward. It matters to me. Soo-jin looked up sharply. For the first time, the distance between them disappeared. Why? She asked. He could have told her then. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out the gray scarf, laying it gently beside the envelope. Because the woman who gave me this saved my life. Soo-jin stared at the fabric. Her fingers hovered above it, then touched one frayed corner. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The refrigerator hummed behind them. A faucet dripped somewhere in the kitchen. I remember this, she whispered. Min-jae stopped breathing for a moment. Soo-jin lifted the scarf and examined the worn stitching near the edge. I gave this to someone. Her eyes moved to his face. A man named Min. He nodded once. That was me. She stepped backward. The envelope slipped from her fingers and landed softly on the counter. You. Her voice barely carried. Min-jae removed the scarf from his neck and placed it between them. I came back because I couldn't forget what you did. Soo-jin stared at him, then at the worn clothes, the rough hands, the empty backpack. You were the man from that night. Yes. She swallowed and looked toward the door. Then why are you living like this? Min-jae answered quietly. Because I wanted to find out if I could find you without using the power that made me lose sight of you. Soo-jin's eyes remained fixed on him. Then she picked up the envelope and held it against her chest. If you're really the man I saved, she said, then tomorrow, you need to hear why I disappeared. And with that, the woman he had crossed Seoul to find finally agreed to tell him the truth. The next evening, Han Soo-jin placed 2 cups of hot tea on the kitchen table, but neither of them touched the steam. Rain tapped against the windows, and the fluorescent light above them flickered every few seconds, turning the small room pale and gray. Soo-jin opened the envelope from the old restaurant and removed a single folded note. After that night, she said, someone came looking for me. Min-jae remained still. Who? Men who knew your name. Her fingers tightened around the paper. They never told me to hurt you. They told me to forget you. They said if I kept talking about the stranger who came into that restaurant, I would regret it. Min-jae's jaw tightened. Did they threaten you? She nodded. So I left. The words were quiet, but the cup in her hand trembled against the saucer. I thought if I disappeared, they would stop looking. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know why they cared. Min-jae lowered his eyes. The rain grew louder against the glass. They were my people, he said. Soo-jin looked at him. I know. I should have protected you. You didn't even know where I was. That doesn't change it. He stood, pushed the chair back, and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, Seoul's lights blurred across the wet streets. For 6 months he had searched for her, because she had saved him. Now he understood why she had vanished. She had been paying a price for doing something kind to a stranger. Min-jae turned around. I'm going back. Soo-jin's eyebrows lifted. Back where? To the life I left. She stood immediately. Why? Because if the power I had made you afraid, then I need to change what that power does. He removed the gray scarf and placed it carefully on the table. But I'm not going back for revenge. Before sunrise, Min-jae returned to the headquarters he had abandoned. The marble lobby smelled of polished wood and coffee, and the sound of expensive shoes echoed across the stone floor. Men who had once watched him enter with lowered heads now stared at his worn jacket and rough hands. Min-jae walked straight into the main room and placed his old watch on the conference table. I left this behind, he said. Nobody answered. He looked around the room. And I left behind a rule that allowed innocent people to be frightened because they crossed our path. One man stepped forward. Boss, what happened to you? Min-jae raised a hand. Nothing happened to me. Something happened to the way I lived. He ordered every employee who had threatened or intimidated Soo-jin to be removed from his organization, and he made one condition clear. Nobody was to approach her again. Then he signed over control of several businesses to managers who would operate them legally and walked out before anyone could stop him. By evening, he stood outside the community kitchen wearing a clean but simple coat. Soo-jin opened the door and stared at him. He did not step inside. He did not give orders. He simply held out his hand. I'm Kang Min-jae, he said. The man you saved. Soo-jin looked at his hand, then at his face. After a long silence, she reached forward and took it. This time, the most powerful man in Seoul was no longer asking her to save him. He was asking for the chance to become someone worthy of the kindness she had given him. 3 months later, the community kitchen smelled of fresh bread, sesame oil, and warm broth as Han Soo-jin placed 2 bowls on the same wooden table where she had once listened to Kang Min-jae explain why he had become homeless to find her. Morning light spilled across the scratched tabletop, catching the steam rising from the soup. Min-jae sat across from her in a simple dark sweater, his sleeves rolled above his wrists, the roughness of his hands now familiar to her. He no longer lived beneath the bridge. But he had never returned to the life he had abandoned. The luxury apartment was gone. The private car was gone. Most of the empire he once controlled had been dismantled, and the businesses he kept were now operated legally, with no one using fear to silence ordinary people. Soo-jin lifted her spoon. You really gave all that up? Min-jae looked at the soup instead of her. Not all of it. She waited. I kept the parts that could be changed. She smiled faintly. And the rest? I let them go. Outside, buses rolled through the intersection, their brakes sighing against the pavement. Inside, dishes clinked and volunteers moved between the tables. It was an ordinary morning. That was exactly what Min-jae had wanted. He reached into his coat and placed something beside Soo-jin's bowl. The old gray scarf. She touched the frayed edge and laughed softly. You still have this? You gave it to me. It was just a scarf. It was the first thing anyone had given me without asking who I was. Soo-jin looked at him for a long moment. Then she folded the scarf and pushed it back toward him. Keep it. Min-jae shook his head. Why? Because you don't need it to remember anymore. He looked down at the scarf. 6 months ago, he had slept on concrete with her name written on his palm because he believed finding her would settle a debt. He had crossed Seoul with $20 in his pocket, washed dishes, carried boxes, and accepted meals from strangers. He had become homeless by choice because he needed to know whether the woman who saved him would still see a human being when everything that made him powerful was stripped away. Soo-jin had answered without ever asking for anything in return. She had fed him when she thought he was only a stranger. She had protected him without knowing his name. And when she finally learned who he was, she had not asked for money, revenge, or a place in his world. She had simply asked him to become better than the man who first walked through her door. Min-jae pushed the scarf back toward her. Then maybe you should keep it. She accepted it and folded it carefully into her bag. What will you do now? She asked. He looked through the window at the city beyond them. Work. Help here. Live quietly. Soo-jin raised an eyebrow. A mafia boss running a soup kitchen? Min-jae almost smiled. Former. She laughed, and the sound softened the hard edges of the room. Then she lifted her bowl toward him. Eat. He picked up his spoon. The same word. The same simple kindness. But this time, he understood what it had meant all along. He had once believed Soo-jin saved his life by keeping him alive for one night. Now he knew she had saved something far more important. The man beneath the power, the name, and the fear. And that day, Kang Min-jae finally understood that the woman he crossed a city and surrendered a kingdom to find had never wanted him to remain powerful. She had simply wanted him to become worthy of the kindness that saved him.